What would you do if 17 enemy aircraft appeared out of the clouds, all aiming for the single fragile biplane you were flying, and there was no one coming to help you? Before the world understood what aerial combat could truly become, before aces gained their legends, and before nations realized how brutally the sky could turn against a man, there was a moment, a single, terrifying moment, when a lone pilot found himself surrounded by a swarm of Austrian warplanes. And somehow he did not die. Somehow he flew away untouched. But nothing about that morning suggested survival. The sky was unnervingly calm, the kind of deceptive calm that has fooled soldiers for centuries. It was the quiet before a storm no one had predicted. The pilot, flying a machine that already felt outdated in a world racing toward mechanized fury, sensed something strange in the air. The light was dimmer than usual. The wind shifted with an unsettling irregularity. And then, without warning, shadows began to break through the haze, one after another, multiplying, stacking, tightening, their circle like predators, testing the edge of their trap. He counted 3 at first, then 5, then 90. By the time he realized what was unfolding, it was already too late. 17 Austrian fighters had converged on him, forming a hunting formation so precise it seemed choreographed. Aerial warfare was still young, yet these pilots moved with the confidence of predators that knew exactly how to tear a solitary target apart. His engine hummed, almost trembling, as if aware of the nightmare closing in. His aircraft, a simple biplane held together by fabric, wood, and stubbornness, had no business surviving even a few seconds under such overwhelming force. But the pilot wasn't panicking, not yet, because something inside him, something instinctive and primal, registered a crucial detail. The Austrians believed he was already dead, and that belief, that dangerous overconfidence, was the only opening he had. They approached slowly, savoring the kill. 17 aircraft against 1 should never have been a story. It should have been a footnote, a line in a military report, a statistic buried under thousands of other wartime tragedies. But what happened next would shatter logic, overturn expectations, and force military strategists to reevaluate what a single pilot could do when stripped of every advantage except pure will. He felt the first vibration through the controls, the signal that they were close enough to fire. The air thickened, the pressure rising as if the atmosphere itself had begun to fold inward. His mind sharpened, his pulse steadied. The horizon tilted slightly, a reminder that every angle of the coming fight would matter. There was no room for error, no time for hesitation, no possibility of retreat. Yet he did something that still confuses historians today. Instead of diving, instead of fleeing, instead of surrendering to the logical response of any sane pilot, he held his course. He waited. He allowed the 17 aircraft to tighten their grip until escape seemed mathematically impossible. Because deep down, buried beneath fear and instinct, he recognized something the Austrians did not. A perfectly closed trap can sometimes collapse on the hunter. And so he watched, calculating, absorbing every detail of their formation, their spacing, their angles of descent. He noticed slight inconsistencies in the leading aircraft, micro adjustments in their alignment, a subtle hesitation in their synchronization. These were weaknesses, nearly invisible, but powerful enough for a man desperate enough to turn them into survival. The pilot tightened his gloves, drew one long breath, locked onto the tiniest gap forming among the Austrian fighters. If he timed it wrong, he would die instantly. If he timed it right, he would buy himself only a few seconds of life. But sometimes a few seconds are all history needs. What he did next would become one of the most improbable escape maneuvers ever recorded in early aviation. But before we step into the moment that changed everything, let me ask you something. Do you want me to... Before we continue with the unbelievable story of this lone biplane, take a moment to do something that really helps us keep uncovering these hidden moments of history. Drop a comment right now. Tell us where you're watching from and what you think you would have done if you were in the pilot's seat facing 17 enemy planes. Every single comment helps this story reach more people who love these intense, almost impossible wartime moments. If you've ever been amazed by survival stories, hit that like button. It's more than just a click. It tells YouTube to share this story with viewers who crave the extraordinary and the unbelievable. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next incredible tale from the archives of military history. These are stories that deserve to be remembered, analyzed, and debated, and your engagement makes that possible. He was not supposed to become a legend. In fact, when he first entered military aviation, no one predicted anything extraordinary about him. He wasn't the strongest, the fastest, or even the most technically gifted among his peers. But there was something in him, something quiet, sharpened by experience, and shaped by the harshness of early aerial warfare that made him different. Long before the day 17 Austrian planes descended upon him, he had already survived situations that should have ended his life. Moments where instinct overpowered fear, where improvisation replaced training, and where the thin line between luck and mastery blurred into something almost supernatural. He had grown up watching the world transform. Machines were taking over the battlefield, replacing the old certainties of cavalry chargers and infantry lines with roaring engines, spinning propellers, and the terrifying new reality of death descending from the sky. While many pilots celebrated the thrill of flight, he recognized something else lurking within it. The crushing isolation, the brutal unpredictability, and the knowledge that every ascent into the clouds might be your last. Yet, instead of turning away, he leaned into that danger. He studied it, he understood it, and he learned to listen to the sky the way others listened to their heartbeat. That sensitivity became his greatest weapon. On that fateful morning, when the wind carried an unusual tension and the horizon felt strangely heavy, he sensed trouble long before he saw the Austrian formation. Pilots often spoke of a sixth sense, a feeling that warns you a split second before the world collapses. He had that sense, but unlike most, he acted on it. He scanned the clouds, adjusted his posture, and prepared himself not for a simple patrol, but for survival. It was as if his mind had already begun constructing escape routes from a trap that hadn't yet closed. His commanders described him as calm to a fault. Mechanics admired how meticulously he inspected his fragile machine, touching every wire and bolt as if he were diagnosing a living creature. Fellow pilots found him hard to read, quiet, intense, almost unnervingly focused when the engine roared to life. But when he flew, everything made sense. The sky became an extension of his body. Every shift in pressure, every tremor in the engine, every glint of sunlight off a distant wingtip registered instantly. Still, nothing in his training, Nothing in anyone's training at that time prepared pilots to face 17 coordinated enemy fighters. Yet, as the threat closed in, something shifted inside him. Fear didn't vanish. Fear rarely does. But he confined it, boxed it, used it. His mind accelerated, mapping angles, calculating distances, replaying maneuvers he had mastered during narrow scrape incidents no one ever documented. He remembered our time when a mechanical failure forced him to glide between mountain ridges so tight they shredded fabric from his wings. Another time when a misjudged turn nearly sent him spiraling into a trench line. Each disaster had left him marked, but also sharpened, like metal forged under repeated blows. He learned survival the hard way, and that hard-earned instinct was now all he had. Because when 17 predators encircled him, he didn't see a hopeless situation. He saw possibilities, faint, nearly impossible paths carved out of tiny misalignments and unnoticed human errors. He saw flaws in the Austrian formation. He saw impatience in their descent. He saw men too certain of victory, and certainty can be fatal in war. His hands tightened on the controls as he prepared to do what no sane pilot would attempt. But sanity had no place in what was about to unfold. What mattered was something else entirely. The unbreakable refusal to die in a moment that history expected to swallow him. Whole! Yet the most astonishing part of this story is still ahead, because the pilot's mindset was only half the reason he survived. The other half was the fragile, underestimated machine beneath him and the strange advantages hidden within its weaknesses. And that is exactly where the next revelation begins. It was a machine that belonged to a fading era, a relic of early aviation thrown into a war that evolved faster than engineers could keep up. At a glance, the biplane looked almost fragile, with its fabric-covered wings, exposed struts, and a fuselage that rattled whenever turbulence whispered across its frame. Compared to the sleeker, faster, more aggressive Austrian fighters that hunted him, it seemed hopelessly outmatched. But survival in the unforgiving world of early aerial combat didn't always belong to the strongest machine. Sometimes it belonged to the one no one bothered to understand. The pilot knew every imperfection of his aircraft. He felt them through the controls like a physician diagnosing a patient. The slight leftward drag at full throttle, the flutter in the lower wing when wind pressure shifted, the tiny delays in engine response that could become fatal if misjudged by even a fraction of a second. But he also knew something the Austrian pilots had not accounted for. The biplane's weaknesses hid unexpected strengths. Strengths invisible to those relying solely on technical superiority. For one, the aircraft's lightweight frame, so often mocked by more experienced flyers, granted it an agility that defied logic. It could twist, dip, and pivot in angles impossible for the heavier, faster enemy fighters. Its low speed, ironically, made it harder to track during close encounters. While modern aircraft relied on power to dominate the sky, this biplane relied on unpredictability. It didn't challenge physics. It danced with it. The double-wing configuration, though outdated by emerging monoplane designs, generated lift so efficiently that the pilots could perform maneuvers that looked reckless from the ground, sudden climbs, tight turns, and near stalls without the catastrophic consequences faster aircraft would face. And most importantly, when caught in a tight formation like the one tightening around him, a slower aircraft could sometimes slip through gaps too narrow for its heavier opponents to exploit. But these quirks came with dangers. The biplane's structure couldn't absorb much damage. Well placed burst of machine gun fire could tear fabric clean off the frame or snap a supporting beam, sending the aircraft tumbling into the earth. The pilot knew this better than anyone. Every sound mattered: the creak of wood, the strain on the wires, the pitch of the engine as it fought to maintain rhythm. One mistake would be enough to unravel everything. Yet that fragility forced him into a mindset his opponents lacked: absolute precision. Austrian fighters relied on overwhelming force, speed, and coordinated attack patterns. His survival depended on subtlety, on reading microcurrents in the air, interpreting the shifting geometry of wings around him, and timing his movements to an almost impossible degree. In that sense, the biplane was not just a machine. It was an extension of his instincts. As the Austrian formation contracted, the contrast between the two sides became painfully clear. Their aircraft roared with confidence, engines pushing hard, wings slicing through the air like blades. His machine, by comparison, hummed nervously, but it was flexible, reactive, almost alive in his hands. What they perceived as weakness was, in the right moment, an advantage no tactical manual had prepared them for. The Austrians thought they were boxing in a helpless target. What they were actually doing was unknowingly setting the stage for the biplane's greatest strength to emerge: the ability to slip through seams created by their own aggression. A machine dismissed as obsolete was about to demonstrate that survival in war is often dictated not by raw power, but by the fighter who understands the sky in ways others overlook. And as the formation tightened even more, the moment approached when the pilot would be forced to use every hidden advantage his fragile aircraft offered or perish in the attempt. They emerged from the clouds like a wall of steel, engine growls blending into a single predatory vibration that the pilot felt in his ribs before he truly saw them. 17 Austrian fighters, disciplined, coordinated, and armed with the cold certainty of an easy kill. Early air combat was chaotic in most battles, but not here, not in this moment. The Austrian formation moved with a calculated precision that came only from pilots who had rehearsed this exact scenario dozens of times. Isolate the target, intimidate the target, overwhelm the target, eliminate the target. A flawless strategy, at least on paper. From above, the formation resembled a tightening ring, each fighter positioned at a slightly different altitude to block the biplane's escape routes. They approached with a confidence bordering on arrogance, flying aggressive, shallow angles that announced dominance long before bullets were fired. The lead aircraft held steady, acting as the spearhead, while the others fanned out behind it, step by step, compressing the circle like a vice. Their wings glinted in the morning light, not the brilliant shine of polished metal, but the dull reflection of machines built for one purpose: to end another man's life before breakfast. The pilot watched them come, counting each silhouette, memorizing their rhythm. It wasn't fear that paralyzed him in those seconds. It was calculation. He knew Austrian doctrine well enough to predict their next move. He understood how their formation worked, how their patterns condensed, where gaps were likely to appear and where none would appear at all. But this Jimmy, the precision was too perfect, too disciplined. They were not making the mistakes that inexperienced fighters often made. 17 pilots moved as one organism, wings angled to trap him. Machine guns already aligned with the almost ceremonial certainty of a firing squad. From the perspective of the Austrian pilots, the engagement was over before it began. They saw a slow, outdated biplane floating helplessly, a relic against an entire hunting pack. They expected panic. They expected a desperate dive or an erratic turn that would expose him to gunfire. Instead, the lone aircraft continued forward with unnerving steadiness. No frantic jerks, no frantic attempts to escape. It was as if the pilot didn't grasp the magnitude of the danger, which, in their minds, only continued to confirm the impending simplicity of their victory, but their confidence masked a deeper vulnerability. Overconfidence creates blind spots. As the formation narrowed the circle, minor inconsistencies began to appear, almost imperceptible to the attackers, but glaring to the pilot trapped within. A slightly misaligned wing, a trailing fighter drifting half a meter too far to the right, a pair of aircraft descending a fraction too early, adjusting their angle before the rest of the group. In a loose encounter, none of this would have mattered, but inside a compressed formation of 17 aircraft, every deviation, no matter how tiny, had the potential to bend the geometry of the trap. The pilot saw it, and unlike the Austrians, he had nothing to lose by exploiting it. Wind conditions shifted, brushing unevenly across the descending fighters. 2 aircraft overcorrected simultaneously, creating a ripple in the formation. It lasted no more than half a second, but it was enough to reveal something critical. Cracks, hidden fractures in the perfect cage. The Austrians believed they had built cracks that only a man with heightened instincts, a fragile aircraft, and an iron will to live could recognize as opportunity. Still, this awareness came with a harsh truth. Exploiting these gaps meant flying into even more danger. He would have to move closer to the jaws of the trap, not away from them. He would need to maneuver between gun arcs, glide under firing lines, and slip through openings that barely existed. One mistake, a single misjudged angle, would tear his wings apart and end his story mid. But the pilot also understood something the Austrians didn't. Proximity can be protection. The closer he was to them, the harder it became for 17 fighters to coordinate without risking collision. They wanted distance to fire cleanly. He wanted closeness to disrupt their rhythm. 2 opposing instincts about to collide in the sky. The ring tightened again. Engines howled. Gun barrels aligned. The trap was closing perfectly. And yet, within that perfection, the first seeds of its collapse were beginning to grow. The moment the Austrians opened fire, the sky didn't erupt all at once. It snapped. A violent crack of machine gun bursts ripped through the air, stitching lines of death across the space where the biplane should have been. The lead fighters fired confidently, certain their target would crumble on the first pass, but what they didn't realize, not yet, was that their flawless formation had created a hidden danger. The perfect shot required perfect timing, and 17 pilots do not time anything perfectly. The pilot felt the wind shift an instant before the bullets reached him. A subtle tremor in the pressure, a whisper of disruption. And then he acted with a sudden, unnatural dip, a maneuver so low and so tight, it nearly forced his fragile aircraft into stall. He slipped under the initial arc of fire to the Austrian attackers. It looked like a panicked, clumsy move, but it wasn't. It was the only path left that didn't lead to instant death, and in taking it, he triggered the first critical flaw in their attack. The fighters in the second line adjusted too quickly, eager to compensate and finish the kill. Their aggressive correction forced the third line to change angles as well, and for the briefest moment, 17 aircraft were no longer one coordinated organism. They were 17 individuals, each with slightly different airspeed, slightly different altitude, slightly different line of sight. The geometry of the trap began to distort, and distortion in aerial combats is a silent killer. The biplane skimmed just above the slipstream of the nearest fighter, the thin fabric wings trembling under violent turbulence. He wasn't out of danger, not even close, But he had entered the one space the Austrians were least prepared for, the chaotic zone at the heart of their own formation. Their firepower meant nothing here. Their speed became a liability. Their discipline worked against them. Then came the fatal mistake. In their eagerness to press the advantage, two Austrian fighters fired simultaneously at the descending biplane. But they had not registered how close they had drifted to each other. Their fields of fire overlapped. Their machine gun tracers crossed. Neither hit the biplane but one. Grazed the wing of another Austrian aircraft, forcing it into a sudden, uncontrolled swerve. It wasn't a catastrophic hit. It didn't bring the plane down. But it was enough to break the flow. Planes that had been closing as a perfect circle suddenly wavered. One turned too sharply. Another slowed half a second too long. A chain reaction of micro-errors rippled through the formation, small on their own, deadly when multiplied by 17. The pilot noticed instantly. In the chaos of tightening spirals, aggressive turns, and overlapping he saw the first real opportunity. A narrow, almost invisible seam opening in the collapsing formation. A seam that existed for only a breath. A seam he would need to throw his entire aircraft into if he hoped to survive even another 10 seconds. But to reach it, he had to do something that defied logic. He had to fly toward the attackers, not away. He pushed the biplane into a sharp climbing turn, the wings groaning under the strain. Bullets screamed past the fuselage. Air pressure clawed at the frame. The Austrians tried to readjust, but now their angles were wrong. Their lines of fire interfered with each other. Their positioning forced hesitation, and hesitation is a death sentence in the sky. For the first time since the ambush began, the hunters felt uncertainty. The first attack, the one that should have ended everything, had failed. But the danger was far from over, because the pilot had just placed himself inside the storm where the Austrians' next move could either crush him instantly or unravel their entire strategy. The air around him had transformed into a spinning cage of metal and gunfire, yet the pilot showed none of the frantic panic his attackers expected. Instead, something shifted inside him, and in a clarity that only emerges when a person is forced to operate beyond fear. In that razor-thin space between life and death, his mind stopped reacting and started breathing. He no longer saw 17 enemies. He saw angles, trajectories, pressure zones, and the subtle choreography of machines moving through unstable air. To the Austrian pilots, his sudden surge upward looked reckless, almost suicidal. But to him, it was geometry. Every motion he made, the tilt of a wing, the fraction of throttle he added, the split-second hesitation before diving again, was informed by invisible forces they couldn't feel. He didn't have the faster engine or the thicker armor. What he had was a deep bond with his fragile aircraft, a bond that allowed him to sense turbulence before it formed and predict airflow disturbances before they reached him. As the fighters swarmed around him, he noticed tiny tells, a slight shake in an approaching wingtip, a premature climb from one of the pursuers, a hesitation in another's firing arc. These weren't mistakes, not yet, but they were openings, embryonic cracks in the Austrian assault that could be expanded if he reacted with surgical timing. And that timing was all he had left. He rolled sharply to the right, just as two fighters attempted to realign above him. The movement placed him dangerously close to their guns, but it also positioned him under a downdraft he had sensed moments earlier. A column of sinking air that pulled his biplane downward faster than gravity alone could manage. The Austrians overshot the attack, expecting him to climb, not fall. For a heartbeat, he vanished from their line of fire. When he reappeared, he wasn't running. He was maneuvering. This wasn't bravery. It was instinct sharpened into something almost primal. He flew as if the sky itself was speaking to him in a code only he could decipher. Desperation. Yes, but desperation channeled through experience, skill, and refusal to accept the outcome. The Austrians had written for him. One enemy fighter tightened too early and crossed in front of another, forcing the second pilot to break formation. That disruption sent ripples through the rest of the group, each pilot adjusting a fraction of a second later than the one before. In a formation of 4, it would have been recoverable. In a formation of 17, it was catastrophic. The pilot felt the energy shift. Their unity was cracking. He davaging, angling the biplane toward a cluster of fighters rather than away from them. A move no textbook, no instructor, no sane strategist would ever endorse. But he understood something the Austrians didn't. The tighter the space, the harder it became for them to fire without risking each other. He was creating his own shield out of their aggression, forcing them to hesitate, to choose caution over certainty. And hesitation is a toxin in aerial combat. While the Austrian pilots hesitated for mere slivers of seconds, he acted his biplane, twisted sideways, wings groaning as he threaded himself through a gap that existed for less time than a heartbeat. It was not a maneuver taught in any training camp. This was survival born from near disaster after near disaster, a muscle memory carved by experiences no one else had lived through. For the first time since the ambush began, the Austrians realized something disturbing. Disma wasn't just surviving by luck. He was responding. He was adapting, and more terrifyingly, he was beginning to control the rhythm of the encounter. 17 predators were now being manipulated not by superior machinery, but by a pilot who understood the sky like a living organism. But his most audacious move was still ahead. A maneuver so improbable that even experienced pilots would later refuse to believe it happened. What happened next would later be described by veteran pilots as a maneuver no sane man would attempt, and no inexperienced man could survive. With 17 fighters circling him like a tightening storm, the pilot made a decision that defied every rule of aerial combat. He would not escape by fleeing. He would escape by entering the chaos. The Austrian fighters, confident in their formation, continued to compress the circle, pushing him toward a kill zone where overlapped firing arcs would finally seal his fate. But the pilot knew something they didn't. Their formation, though precise, required each aircraft to maintain a perfect distance, angle, and speed. If he could disrupt even one of those variables, the entire formation would begin to distort. And distortion in a complex aerial pattern could be far deadlier to them than to him. He angled his fragile biplane upward, not to climb away, but to force an Austrian fighter to react. The enemy pilot jerked his machine slightly left, a subtle adjustment meant to maintain spacing. But that tiny deviation rippled outward like a crack spreading across glass. 2 fighters adjusted to compensate. A third dipped lower. A 4th drifted too wide. These movements were minuscule, but at high speed, in tight formation. Minuscule is catastrophic. The pilot felt the shift before he saw it. Air pressure danced across his wings in a way that told him the formation's geometry had broken. And instead of retreating from that breaking point, he flew into it. He tilted the biplane into a knife-edged glide, slicing through the seam like a blade slipping between armor plates. The sudden maneuver forced several Austrian pilots to abort their firing passes. None of them could shoot without risking one another. Their guns, once a unified wall of death, became useless. Inside the turmoil of their collapsing formation, machine gun bursts streaked past him, bright, desperate lines that illuminated just how close death hovered. The biplane shook under the violent turbulence, its wings groaning with the strain, fabric snapping like torn sails. But he held his course, trusting his knowledge of how his aircraft flexed, how it bent without breaking, how it responded to pressure in ways the Austrians could not predict. For several harrowing seconds, he wasn't flying through the sky. He was weaving through razor-thin pockets of survival. Every shift of his wrist, every adjustment of throttle, every tilt of the rudder required perfection. A single misalignment would send him spiraling into the firing ox, now overlapping all around him. But in that madness, he found rhythm. The Austrian fighters were no longer a coordinated threat. They were obstacles. Their angle corrections created temporary shields. Their panic made them slower. Their speed worked against them, while a slower, lighter aircraft slipped through pockets of air they overshot, and the realization struck them like cold water. They were losing control of the fight. The hunter had accidentally become the hunted, not because the biplane was superior, but because the pilot had transformed the airspace into a battlefield, where reaction mattered more than firepower. When two fighters attempted to reposition simultaneously, their trajectories crossed too closely, forcing one to pull up sharply. That sudden climb disrupted the airflow around three others, creating a swirling pocket of turbulence. The pilot recognized instantly. He dove into it, letting the chaotic air push his biplane downward faster than gravity alone could carry him. Again, bullets screamed overhead, hitting nothing. He wasn't just dodging attacks. He was controlling where they fired. This was the moment the Austrians finally understood. This man was not flying to escape. He was flying to survive by rewriting the rules of the engagement. But even as he slipped through the final gap of their broken ring, the maneuver had cost him altitude, energy, and time. And the Austrians, recovering from their shock, were already repositioning for another strike. The sky had shifted in his favor, but it had not yet granted him escape. He slipped through the collapsing formation, but he wasn't free. Not yet. The Austrians, furious at losing their coordinated kill, broke into smaller attack groups that dove after him with renewed aggression. Their earlier confidence had evaporated. Now they flew like predators who had tasted humiliation, determined to correct it with overwhelming violence. The sky filled with the rising scream of vengeance, gunfire echoing between clouds like rolling thunder. And in that desperate chase, the pilot realized something critical. The Austrians were no longer thinking. They were reacting, and reacting pilots make predictable mistakes. The biplane had lost altitude in his last maneuver, dropping him into denser, more turbulent air, dangerous for a fragile aircraft, but equally disruptive to fast, narrow-winged fighters. He felt the pressure hammer, the fabric of his wings, pushing and pulling in chaotic bursts. Another man would have fought it. He didn't. He listened to it, and in that unstable turbulence, he sensed an opening, a momentary lull in the chaos, a shift in the wind, a narrowing pocket of air that only a pilot fused to his machine could recognize. 3 Austrian fighters approached from above, forming a spear aimed straight at his spine. 2 more descended from the left, a pincer attack lethal, efficient, unavoidable. From the perspective of the pursuing pilots, the biplane was already dead. All they needed was a final firing angle. But what they did not see was the invisible wall of descending air ahead a downdraft forming just meters below his wings. It was the kind of airflow that could ruin a climb, crush, lift, or tear a wing loose if handled poorly. For the Austrians, it was a hazard. For him, it was the key. He cut throttle for a heartbeat. The biplane dropped like a stone. The Austrian pilots overshot instantly. Their attack timing shattered. They fired too early, bullets tracing harmlessly above his canopy as momentum carried them past the space he should have occupied. Shock rippled through the group, but they had no time to adjust, because the pilot wasn't just falling. He was preparing the turn. With a violent torque of the rudder and a precision roll that should have snapped the wings clean off, he yanked the fragile biplane into one of the tightest descending spirals ever attempted in early aviation. The aircraft groaned, wood bending at its limits, fabric threatening to tear, but the maneuver was perfectly synchronized with the downdraft. Instead of fighting the collapsing airflow, he rode it, letting it accelerate the spiral far beyond what the Austrians believed the biplane could withstand. To the fighters above him, his sudden disappearance made no sense. One moment, he was there. The next, he was a blur, dropping into the haze below. By the time they tried to mimic the maneuver, they were already too late. Their heavier aircraft couldn't pivot in time. Their momentum trapped them in shallow dives that carried them far outside the attack vector. The biplane didn't just evade them, it escaped the kill zone entirely. He leveled out so low that his wheels nearly brushed the treetops, the world rushing past in streaks of green and brown. Behind him, the Austrian formation dissolved into chaos. Pilots shouting over radios, aircraft colliding with their own turbulence, firing arcs useless at the new altitude. For the first time in the engagement, the sky fell silent around him. Not because the danger was gone, it never truly was, but because he had done something the Austrians had not prepared for. He changed the battlefield. The fight was no longer happening in their carefully controlled upper airspace. It was now happening down low in unstable winds, unpredictable thermals, and terrain that punished speed. The environment suddenly favored the slower, lighter, more maneuverable aircraft. His aircraft, and the Austrians realized with chilling clarity, they had chased him into the one altitude where 17 fighters could no longer move as a single deadly unit. Now the real escape could begin. Dropping too low altitude had given him a momentary advantage, but it also thrust him into a new kind of danger, one that demanded reflexes as sharp as a blade and nerves strong enough to ignore the scream of gunfire tearing through the air behind him. Down here, the wind behaved differently. It curled around hills, sliced through valleys, and twisted itself into unpredictable currents that could lift a wing in 1 second and crush it the next. For the pilot, that chaos was a shield. For the Austrians, it was a battlefield they were never trained to fight in. He skimmed along the treetops so closely that leaves rattled under his slipstream. Bullets streaked past, snapping branches, kicking up splinters that spiraled through the air like deadly insects. The roar of engines above him felt heavier now, more frantic. The Austrians were no longer predators closing in. They were hunters losing control, their attack patterns breaking apart as altitude robbed them of speed and formation discipline. 2 fighters dove aggressively, trying to corner him before he slipped into the next patch of forest. They expected him to pull up. Instead, he pushed the nose down, diving into the narrow gap between 2 lines of trees where no fighter should ever risk entry. The biplane's wings shuddered violently, fabric whining under the sudden compression of air. But Herlid, steady, letting the terrain funnel him into a natural corridor that hid him from the majority of his attackers. The Austrians tried to follow, And that was their mistake. Their engines roared too loudly. Their turns were too wide, their speeds too fast for the jagged terrain that punished every miscalculation. One fighter clipped a treetop, losing part of its lower wing. Another pulled up at the last second to avoid impact, breaking away from the pursuit entirely. The sky behind him filled with their frustration, a chorus of engines straining, pilots shouting, a formation that had devolved into fragments of desperate pursuit. Yet his danger wasn't over. A cluster of fighters regrouped above, approaching from a higher angle. They executed a vertical dive, the kind meant to crush a fleeing target by sheer velocity. Their guns lit up the air, and for a split second, bullets stitched a deadly pattern around him. The biplane trembled as rounds pierced the air just centimeters from the canvas skin. One bullet grazed a support wire, sending a sharp vibration through the entire frame. Another tore through a patch of fabric on the lower wing, creating a flutter that threatened to destabilize his lift. He felt the aircraft beginning to drift. Another man might have panicked, but he adjusted instantly, compensating with tiny, precise corrections, nudging the rudder, adjusting pitch, balancing throttle with sensitivity. Born from surviving failures, no training manual could have prepared him for. His aircraft was damaged, yes, but not broken, and in his hands, even a damaged machine could still be guided like an extension of instinct. Then came the critical moment. A narrow canyon opened ahead, a dark slit between rising hills. To enter it was madness. The airflow would be violently unstable, the walls too close, the margin for error non-existent, but it offered something the open sky no longer could. A barrier between him and 17 guns. If he entered it, the Austrians would be forced to attack from above, limiting their angles. If he missed it even by a meter, he would be erased. He aimed for it anyway. The biplane plunged into the corridor, wings nearly brushing stone. Wind slammed against the fuselage in violent bursts. Turbulence kicked the aircraft from side to side, forcing him to wrestle with every shift of pressure. Behind him, the Austrians pulled up sharply, unable to follow. They circled desperately above the canyon mouth, firing blindly, in hopes of landing a lucky hit. But he was already gone. Inside that dark passage of rock and wind, he flew as if navigating the inside of a storm, trusting nothing except instinct, reactions, and the fragile machine that had refused to die. It was a flight of terror, a flight of impossible precision, and a flight that bought him what he needed most. Distance. By the time he emerged back into open air, the Austrians were scattered, confused, and struggling to relocate him. He had slipped through their final, furious strike, the second miracle of the day. Surviving the chase itself was complete. But the battle wasn't finished yet, because now came the hardest part. The return, a journey through hostile skies with damage on his wings, limited altitude, and the possibility that the Austrians might still reorganize for one last attack. When he burst out of the canyon and into open sky again, the world felt unnaturally vast, as if the sky itself had widened in recognition of what he had just survived. The Austrian fighters were nowhere in sight. Not above, not behind, not flanking him in another deadly crescent. For the first time since the ambush began, the air was quiet. But it was not a comforting quiet. It was the silence that follows disaster. the kind that tests whether a man's nerves will finally collapse after holding too tightly for too long. His biplane drifted for a moment, wounded but alive. The torn fabric on his wing fluttered like a heartbeat. Frame groaned with every shift of wind, reminding him that he was flying a damaged aircraft over enemy territory. The escape had been miraculous, but returning home would demand something different. Endurance, precision, luck, and above all, the ability to remain calm when the adrenaline that had kept him alive began to evaporate. He scanned the horizon. Nothing. Just the pale outline of distant mountains and a sky washed in early sunlight. He adjusted altitude slightly, nursing his aircraft. Upward, inch by inch. The engine coughed once, then twice, reminding him that even the smallest mechanical failure could undo everything he had accomplished. The biplane's controls felt softer now, less responsive. But he understood the machine. He could feel where it was strained, where it was weak, and where it could still be pushed without collapsing. Every kilometer he crossed felt like a negotiation with fate. As he flew deeper into friendly airspace, the tension inside him shifted. The threat of the Austrian swarm faded, replaced by a new dread. What if they were regrouping? What if they were circling around to intercept him again? What if another patrol spotted him from above, seeing nothing but a limping target begging to be shot down? He forced himself to stay low, skimming the terrain to remain hidden from distant eyes. When he finally saw the outline of his own aerodrome, he wasn't relieved, he was terrified. Damaged aircraft often failed during landing, not during escape. A hard touchdown could snap the weakened struts. A rough crosswind could tear the compromised wing. A misjudged angle could send him cartwheeling into the ground. But there was no choice. His fuel was running thin, and the engine trembled like a wounded animal carrying its last burden. He lined up with the field. Every instinct screamed at him to slow down, but slowing too much could stall the aircraft. He kept pace with the turbulence, guiding the plane with tiny, disciplined adjustments. Mechanics on the ground looked up, stunned by the sight of the battered aircraft descending. Officers rushed outside. Someone recognized the markings. Someone else shouted his name. No one understood how he was still in the sky. The wheels struck ground with a jolt that rattled the frame. The wings dipped dangerously. For a moment, the biplane threatened to collapse into a heap of wood and fabric. But he corrected again, one last perfect motion in a day filled with impossible ones, and the aircraft rolled to a stop. Silence. Then shouting, running, disbelief. Mechanics circled the plane, staring at the damage. Officers demanded explanations. Pilots gathered in awe, whispering in that mix of admiration and fear reserved only for men who have touched death and returned untouched. Some called it a miracle. Others called it madness. But one thing was undeniable. He had flown away from 17 Austrian planes without a single bullet hitting him. His report became military doctrine. His maneuvers were studied, debated, recreated, and still never fully understood. Strategists pointed to his improvisation as proof that the sky, unlike the ground, rewards the unpredictable. Historians later wrote that he redefined what survival meant in the age of early air combat. But to the pilot himself, as he stepped out of the cockpit, legs shaking from exhaustion, it was something simpler. The day he refused to die, his survival was not just an escape. It was a message to the enemy, to the military, and to history that even in a sky shaped by machines and fire, human instinct could still bend the impossible. If you made it all the way to the end of this unbelievable story, You are exactly the kind of person who keeps history alive, the kind who refuses to let extraordinary moments disappear into forgotten archives. And that means your voice matters here more than you realize. So before you go, do one thing that truly helps this channel grow. Leave a comment saying, "I stand with the forgotten pilots." This simple phrase tells me you were here, you felt the tension, and you value these hidden war stories as much as I do. While you're down there, make sure to hit the like button. It tells YouTube that this story deserves to reach thousands more who love military history, strategy, and unbelievable moments of survival. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next video is already on the way, and trust me, you don't want to miss the next chapter of the unknown, the impossible, and the untold.